Now, ladies and gentlemen, we will now be moving on to our panel discussion, and I'm excited for this as well, talking about going beyond borders and how we can navigate a multipolar world. So it is clear we do need to chart the global pathways, us from Singapore to the world, and when the world comes to Singapore, right? But with rising fragmentation and shifting power blocks, how do we as leaders in our respective fields, how do we stay resilient? How do we stay agile and stay relevant? Well, our next panel will also be moderated by Mr. Dylan Sharma. And I'm very excited to be welcoming our esteemed panel up on stage together with Dylan. So please put your hands together as we welcome Professor Donald Low, Senior Lecturer and Professor of Practice in Public Policy, the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. We also have Ms. Lee Suen, Senior Fellow, Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, Yusof Ishak Institute, and Ms. Wu Yemin, Regional Director for Asia Pacific, Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. Once again, you may send your questions via Pigeonhole. We will have the QR code up for you on the screens, and I believe everyone's ready. Dylan, welcome back. Great to see you again.
Thank you.
Panelists, Dylan,
Thank you.
time is all yours.
We follow on from Mr. Ho with 3 more luminaries. My SACEOS colleagues are working me hard, so unfortunately you have me here for another session. But fortunately my role is merely that of a thread weaver, and you'll be hearing from an esteemed panel on their views on our times, present, and most importantly, the future. Now, like we mentioned in the opening segment this morning, these sessions are really for you to extract your own value, your own learnings, your own key takeaways for your business and for yourself, and to make sense of things as they are, and are likely to be, this panel will unpack it for us. So by way of quick introductions, Donald very modestly asked us to describe him as a Professor of Practice at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and author of the just published The Price of Zero, China's Policy Missteps During and After COVID. Now, there's a lot more to Donald, and you'll hear more from the man and his views in the next hour or so. Lee Suen is the Senior Fellow and Coordinator of the Regional Strategic and Political Studies Program at ISEAS, the Yusof Ishak Institute, and editor at Fulcrum. Her areas of interest, just to name but 2, are the rise of China and its strategic implications, as well as technology as a key arena for big power competition, both topics of which you'll be hearing a lot more of. And Wu Yemin has spent a decade and a half as a diplomat representing Singapore at the United Nations in New York City, as well as the World Trade Organization and World Intellectual Property Organization in Geneva. So her knowledge of the inner workings of international bodies are well-founded. Today, Yemin is the Regional Director for the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue and works on reducing conflict and developing opportunities for peace. Now, with that broad introduction, we can delve into the topic for today, Beyond Borders, Navigating a Multipolar World. Thank you to our esteemed panelists for joining us. Now, when we talk about the world today, we have to start really with the United States. Still the epicenter of economic, cultural, and military strength globally. 2025 saw the second inauguration of President Trump, and say what you want about him, whatever your views are, he certainly has been busy. More than 170 executive orders, a clampdown, or maybe we can call it an assault on immigration, an increase in deportations, the signing of his big beautiful bill, alleged securing ceasefires for multiple conflicts, and of course, Liberation Day with its on-off tariff measures. But we are just 6 months into President Trump's 4-year term. So to kick us off on the Donald, let's start with the Donald in the room.
Okay.
Donald.
I really need to change my name.
What can we expect from Trump 2.0?
Well, expect the unpredictable. I mean, Trump has done and said more crazy things and put up more misinformation in the last 6 months than entire presidencies do. So expect the unpredictable. But I think we can already discern certain themes, recurrent themes in his second presidency. And I think the main takeaway for people is not to overreact to Donald Trump. And also the biggest losers, the ones who pay the highest price for his misguided economic policies, are the American people themselves, right? You talked about immigration and deportation. The American economy is incredibly dependent on migrant workers, both legal and undocumented. Look at its attacks on American science and technology. That's the very foundation of American success and American prosperity. His challenge of the rule of law, right? Kwon Ping talked about how Western civilization was built. One of the reasons for why Western civilization was dominant for so many years was because it was premised on the rule of law. And he's attacking and challenging that. And of course, the tariffs, the people who will pay the biggest price for all his tariffs on imports will be his very voters. Right? His voters tend to be lower income, working class Americans. They have less means and fewer substitutes, right? They can't so easily substitute away from cheap imports from abroad. Whereas if you're upper middle class, you're upper class in the US, you can choose to buy more expensive, locally produced, goods. So I think we can expect the unpredictable, and also expect that, that the biggest losers are not going to be the rest of the world. Certainly not going to be China. The biggest losers are going to be the American people themselves, and of course American firms too. Yeah.
Sue-Ann, anything you want to add to what we can expect from Trump 2.0?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to what Donald said, which I agree to, and address the reason why we can expect the unpredictable. And I think it's quite clear that the US is going through an internal revolution of sorts, right? And what Mr. Ho said in the first panel is very instructive, because actually what we're seeing is a very uncomfortable transition period where the old, is gone, is crumbling, and a new is coming ahead, right? It's this transitional space that is full of volatility and unpredictability. And the American society is going through this internal upheaval, right? And it's going to take some time to play out. And you are seeing that Trump is now under pressure, right? So the realities are hitting home for him. His global peacemaking has not gone particularly well. He's had to make a lot of U-turns. His trade deals and a lot of Trump always chickens out this taco, but it's actually showing that the realities are hitting home, and he has had to do this, oops, sorry, U-turn, carve out. Oh, we forgot that if we, tariff Canada and Mexico at a certain level, the auto parts are going to be more expensive and it's going to hurt our own auto industry. Oh, sorry, let's carve that out. And so there's a lot of this lurching forward and backward that is a symptom of the internal sort of revolution that they are also trying to enact. And actually, I think the key thing to understand is that a lot of it is driven by essentially the disenchantment with globalization, right? Which has brought about huge inequalities that governments, including the US, has not managed to equalize or has not managed to redistribute the wealth that has come from globalization to the people. So you're just gonna have a lot of very angry people out there. I like to call it the politics of anger, and a lot of desire to overturn what has been seen as an elite-driven institutions that have benefited the rich and left the poor in the dust. It will take a long time for the US to play this out, and that's why you're going to see a lot of unpredictability.
So a lot of unpredictability, a lot of policies that bite back, that don't benefit the people that voted him in to better their lives and better their lot. But Trump's, of course, famous for pandering to his base, and he does a lot of posturing, right?
Well,
And,
even his base is now getting upset with him, right? Because of the Jeffrey Epstein things. And so you're seeing a backlash, even as he starts to do things that are, in a sense, a bit more normal, right? He has soured on Putin and decided, okay, let's actually provide Ukraine with more arms. You know, he's done things that are now, in a sense, a little bit more mainstream to our view, but then that's upsetting the base, you know.
Internationally, he has certainly tried to arm twist his way, especially on the tariff issues. If I can ask, starting with Donald and then Sue Ann again, does this speak to a new era of might is right?
Yeah, certainly there's a lot of talk about how, you know, in exerting American might, is going against the multilateral rules that, ironically, the US, you know, was most instrumental in creating. It's undermining international law. It's undermining, obviously, the free trade agreements that the US itself had signed, right, with many countries. So certainly there is an increased sense that we are living in a more dangerous world where, what's that phrase? The strong do what they must, and the strong do what they will, what they want, and the rest of us suffer what we must. But at the same time, we shouldn't, again, read too much into this. What he's trying to do is kind of reset or renegotiate the terms of America's engagement with the world. And not just economically, but also in terms of security, America's participation in all these security arrangements. He's trying to renegotiate America's engagement with the rest of the world. They are not saying that the rest of us cannot trade more with one another, right? I mean, so there's nothing to stop us from, say, well, SM Lee said it very well, right? The world will carry on pretty much without the US, right? World minus one. And so, we shouldn't look to the US and say that, because they are upending, right? They are jettisoning the rules of globalization. It marks the end of globalization. All of us will now have to start looking to become more self-sufficient. All of the rest of us should just keep calm and carry on and do whatever we've been doing, liberalizing trade, doing more business with one another, opening up our economies to one another, minus the US. And so I'm reasonably optimistic in that sense that we can survive Trump. As I said just now, the people who pay the biggest price are the Americans and American firms. Look at Singapore in the months since Liberation Day tariff. I mean, at first we were quite fraught, right? We were quite nervous about the effects of tariffs in Singapore. But look at the last 2 months, right? What was it? The STI is at an all-time high. Somebody told me that the MICE industry is booming, right? Nobody's going to Hong Kong anymore, right? So there might be silver linings. Of course, the worst impacts may not have yet hit us. The worst impacts of Trump's antics may not yet have hit us, but we shouldn't feel that this is a catastrophe. We shouldn't feel that this is the end of the world as we know it. And the rest of us should just carry on. I've read also studies which show that, American trade is actually not, the American part of global trade is actually not as high. It's only about 20%. And at the rate that world trade is growing, we can make up for the shortfall in American demand in about 5 to 7 years. So this is a 5 to 7 year, setback, as it were. And I certainly think that this is not the end of the road for globalization and for the system of globalization that the rest of us have committed to.
If I just use 2 examples, the first one being Liberation Day, where no sooner had the tariffs been threatened that numerous countries sent delegations to the White House to negotiate with the Trump administration. And the second example being NATO, that no sooner had Trump threatened to pull out of NATO, that weeks later the NATO SecGen was quoted as saying that President Trump has achieved what no US president in decades could have done by making NATO members spend or agree to spend 5% of their GDP on defense spending. Sue Ann, you spoke about the politics of anger. But shifting gears a little bit, are we now in an era where we are in an international relations of the age of appeasement?
So, it's useful to think of the countries in the world going through the 5 stages of grief over the loss of the America that they knew and they dealt with. And if you remember, the stages of grief are shock and denial, then anger, then bargaining and negotiation, then depression, and then acceptance. And so when you think about the age of appeasement, I would say that most of the countries are still somewhere in the first 3 stages of the 5 stages of grief, right? And so you're seeing the way in which the countries are coming to negotiate with the US and appease the US in some respect is really a reflection of the importance that the role that the US has played economically and in the security realm since World War II. And there's a desire to not want to lose that, right? Because we don't actually know how to go forward. It's been such a mainstay of how the world has operated since World War II. So even as Donald says that in reality, the size of the US export market or share of trade as opposed to the world is not that large, but it's still very significant. And definitely in Southeast Asia, the US market is a vital export market. We import raw materials and intermediate goods from China. So most people may be aware that actually ASEAN runs a trade deficit with China, a huge one. And US is actually the source of our surplus. So we import from China, assemble, and then sell to the US. So if there's no US market, there's really just going to be a huge calamity. So too for NATO and the security umbrella that the US has played. So really this age of appeasement is about, oh my gosh, I don't know what the world would be like without the US. But then, as Donald has also highlighted, I think there's also beginnings of the world trying to move past the 3 stages and getting over the depression and then getting into acceptance. And so actually what we're actually seeing also is a trend towards de-risking from the US. This idea that we must not hold our breath that the US will come back to the table anytime soon. SM Lee has said, the best framework for now is really the world with temporarily -1, and we hope that the US will come back, but if not, let's try and figure out how to move on. And that's actually a very significant and deep thought, It's literally almost saying, let's kind of see whether or not you can write off the US and move forward. But into what? That's really interesting. And it actually goes back to what Mr. Ho was sort of saying. A lot of people are looking to, is China part of the important equation and the solution there? There's lots of issues to do with China also. We can talk about that later, but
we will.
I think that's where we are. So age of appeasement, yes, but also trying to get past those stages of grief into some sort of acceptance that things have fundamentally changed.
Okay. Emin, you have negotiated and chaired various meetings at both the United Nations as well as World Trade Organization. In this, as we talk about its might right and the age of appeasement, my question for you is how do you get someone with such and I'm not saying it's the US, but I'm saying generally, how do you get someone with such an entrenched position or a mindset to budge from what they believe is best for them?
Sure. So an American negotiator once told me this joke. Where does an 800-pound gorilla sit? Anywhere it wants to, right? And it showed that because of the heft of the US, it could do whatever it wants. But interestingly, she also shared that there are challenges that the gorilla faces. And for her, it was that the gorilla is often lonely. Why? Because as Suen highlighted, the gorilla is expected to fight everybody's fights for them, right? And when the fight gets messy, everybody hides behind the gorilla. Also, because of the size of the gorilla, anything it does is overanalyzed, is criticized, is questioned. This is, of course, not an excuse for bad gorilla behavior, right? Like chest thumping or breaking of tables. But it's useful for us as negotiators to understand the mindset and the psyche of the other party. Because as Donald and Swen was talking, we're ultimately dealing with human beings, right? The way that these decisions are being made and the take-backs and the indecisions, all shows that it's actually sometimes human behavior. Now, one thing also to note is that for all of us and for different countries, the gorilla is different, right? We're all facing different gorillas. But the question, as you posed, what do you do when you are faced with a gorilla? And my answer to that has been that ants also have power, right?
Ants.
Ants,
Tiny
yes.
little ants.
Ants are agile, ants are nimble. At the same time, when ants come around and take risks and try new things, very often it is without that scrutiny as a start. Also, it's an opportunity for ants to meet with other animals and build other forms of powerful alliances. But I think the most underrated skill is actually where we build trust. And by being small, you can actually go and whisper into the gorilla's ear, pull them aside, and help them to save face at times. And as a result of that, steer and create a different outcome. Well, just going back to the point of trade, which is that we say that this is part of Trump 2.0, but actually this already started with Trump 1.0, right? When we were at the WTO at that point in time, the US was already dismantling the appellate body when it comes to trade. And when we talked to the American negotiators then, they said that this wasn't just actually because of the new administration. There was actually bipartisan support for such moves because they did feel as if that they were, in a way, behind or losing that edge, right? So not to say whether it's right or wrong, but a lot of these actions, if you look back, has started way before the start of Trump 2.0.
Just to be clear to the audience in the room, we're talking about the gorilla as the US economy, not about the man running the country right now. But to talk about the point about ants, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the United Nations, there is the Forum of Small States, made up of more than, there are 193 countries, I believe, in the United Nations, of which 108 are classified as small states, 10 million or less. So one gorilla, 108 ants, that will be a battle. Sue-Ann, something you wanted to add to that?
I wanted to add to what Emin was, the analogy of the gorilla, which is, but actually the question is what mood is the gorilla in, right? And just going back to my 5 stages of grief again, actually I think the thing to point out is that, and a lot of people have pointed out actually, is to point out that the US for some reason has lost its confidence. It is also not able to come to terms with how things have changed. And a big part of what is motivating Trump's policies, right, is make America great again, right? Meaning that they feel a sense of loss that America is no longer great. And of course, they see China as the most important strategic threat that is threatening to take away their cheese, if you will. But they haven't been able to get out of a hankering for the past. So this whole thing about tariffs being raised in order to bring in the money so that they can reindustrialize, bring back this, the automakers, but in a sense, the arc of industrialization has moved on. The US has come to dominate the services industry, and the Rust Belt is there for a reason, is because actually they deindustrialized themselves, right? So, but then the idea that they are not able to reconcile with that, and then there is so you're actually stuck in that rage lah. They're stuck in the first 2 stages and not able to get out. And then the question from Emin's perspective is, how do you deal with someone who is processing that still and stuck there? And is there any wisdom in terms of how best to engage a country that is in that mood?
Just to add on to both what Emin and Sue-Ann said, there's a great deal of anger, but a lot of the anger is misdirected. The anger in the US is misdirected at globalization. There's this dominant narrative in the US that they have lost out from globalization, that free trade globally has hurt the US and hurt the American middle class and the American working class. Yes and no, right? Who are the biggest winners from globalization? It's actually American firms, right? When they outsource, when they move their production to places like China, Vietnam, wherever, Mexico, the biggest winners, the bulk of the profits still go to American corporations, right? Most of my students are from China, So they say the pair of Nike shoes are made for about 10, 15 US dollars in China. That's China's share, right? But Nike sells it for 150 US dollars. Who makes that margin of
The value.
the value, right? The value added. It goes to American firms, right, that have benefited from the entry of China into global supply chains. The big winners are still US corporations. So the response to that is, of course, we want those gains from trade. The right policy response would have been for the state, for the government to say, let's tax some of those gains from trade and redistribute it, compensate those in the US, the working class manufacturing workers who haven't benefited, right, who have suffered from deindustrialization, from wage stagnation. So there wasn't that domestic compensation mechanism. And of course, in that context where there wasn't sufficient domestic compensation, it was very or relatively easy for someone like Trump to exploit that anger, and then direct that anger at places like China, direct that anger at free trade, at institutions like the WTO, when in fact, the right target of their anger should have been, where was the American state to do that process of, redistributing the gains to those who have not benefited as much. So as much as we try to explain the roots of American anger, we also have to acknowledge that a lot of it is misguided and misdirected and exploited by populist, nativist politicians like Trump.
Okay. Before we move on the subject matter, I just want to be very timely on this question from Pigeonhole that is already gaining some traction for Emin. And the question is, for Emin, I like your analogy about the gorilla and ants. What specific aspects do you think us, as agile ants, have really great ability at? Any success stories in mind?
Sure. There's quite a few, actually. But first, just to finish off of what Donald and Suen was saying, is that there are different types of gorilla, right? Because gorilla behavior is not just because of your size, but also to what Suen says, also because of insecurity. And, what we're going to see, I think, out of the US is less gorilla behavior because of size, but because of the insecurity and therefore the actions. Now, the question is, what do you do in terms of success stories of ants? So, if you think about it, many a times in Singapore, it's not because of our size, therefore we are able to move things along, but because we're able to build these alliances. We are seen as neutral. We're seen as not having such a strong agenda and wanting to bring other people down, right? And as a result, we built the coalitions like the Forum of Small States that Dylan talked about. But also, at the UN, we're often asked to chair negotiations, really because we are able to build consensus, to build bridges, and to produce good outcomes. So many a times when I was out negotiating, we were asked by various parties to say, actually, could you put your name forward? Or could Singapore please take a leadership role, right? Because we trust you. You have that credibility. And I think going back into what Mr. Ho was saying just now in terms of, values and what is it that Singapore can do? Singapore is very good at stewarding, right? We are able to sort of step from the back, but help bring parties together. And we've done that over and over again. And I think that that's a role that Singapore can play, but also the MICE industry. And I'll go into that a little bit later. Just to say that with all that we're talking about, trust is missing. And where trust is missing, you need people like the MICE industry to create spaces to build that connection, to build back that trust. Because without which, that's where, the shared spaces and the common values, they falter.
Okay. From the last session earlier, I promised Mr. Ho that the next panel will answer the question of where will these tariffs lead? So Donald, if we can put it in your good hands.
Well, Trump always chickens out. So as you're already seeing, countries have been, starting with Vietnam, now Japan, have been able to negotiate, first China actually, a much more tolerable level of tariffs. So it gives US what they want, right? At least the illusion that they have been able to extract concessions from these countries that are running, in the mind of the US, large trade surpluses with the US. But it also, at levels of 10, 15%, is tolerable for these economies. I don't think it will fundamentally alter comparative advantage across countries. So globalization, there's more friction to globalization and global trade now. With these tariffs, certainly, globalization wouldn't, progress at the rate it was in the 2000s, right up to the global financial crisis. But I don't think fundamentally the trend of ever more trade and business with across borders. I don't think that will fundamentally change.
Okay.
And I don't think, as Suen says, I agree with Suen that it's unthinkable that the US would reindustrialize. I mean, the US's comparative advantage now is in services, right? It's in tech. If anything, what they're doing now with these tariffs is going to hurt them, not just in terms of it's not going to help them reindustrialize, it's going to hurt them because they kind of are not investing in the things that they need to invest in to maintain their lead, right? Whether it's in science and tech, whether it is in terms of their strength in services.
Okay. We've spent some time talking about the US, but let's move to the other key player, the elephant, or rather the dragon in the room, China. Donald, you've spent the last 6 years now, I believe, in Hong Kong. Right. Can you share with us the current Chinese sentiment during and now after COVID?
Yeah, so after COVID, it was incredibly depressed. And it started, I think that, if you look at one of the most instructive charts, I wish I could show it. One of the most instructive charts you could look at, go and look at Chinese consumer confidence. And it's from a Chinese source, right? When COVID started in 2020, there was a drop in confidence, but not much. And then that quickly recovered as COVID was suppressed in the middle of 2020. And it stayed pretty high, right? The index was, I think, 140%. And then it collapsed. Consumer confidence in China collapsed. Guess when? During the Shanghai lockdown, right? In the second
The price
quarter.
of zero, as you allude to in your book.
Yeah, right. The price of zero is not just public health. It was really about economic devastation and the loss of consumer and investor confidence. And that was also the time when investors, both in China as well as outside of China, considered China uninvestable, right? Around the second quarter, middle of 2022. And it stayed low, consumer confidence, even after the lockdown of Shanghai was lifted. And then at the end of 2022, early 2023, zero COVID went away, right? Suddenly, right? It just suddenly was no more restrictions. And there was a brief recovery of consumer confidence for about 3 months, and then it went back to where it was at the depths of zero COVID during the Shanghai lockdown. And it's pretty much stayed there, right, for the last... So China has been in what I call a deflationary funk, where prices are falling, there's a great deal of overcapacity, where consumers are quite reluctant to spend. There's been some fiscal stimulus, there have been trade-in programs, but generally the sentiment is still quite depressed. And then at the start of this year, two things happened. First, Trump won, and the impact of Trump's victory on China was maybe he will do stuff to make China look good. So I think the real impact of Trump is not to make America great again, it's maybe to make China great again. And second, of course, very relevant to what Mr. Ho was talking about earlier and to your industry, DeepSeek, generative AI, which showed that China can compete. Before DeepSeek came along, we all thought that when it came to large language models, the US is way ahead and China would be left in the dust. And DeepSeek completely changed that narrative, or at least came close to changing that narrative. And so what you've seen in the last 6 months is Chinese markets have started to recover. There's a bit more life among consumers, right? More consumer sentiment seems to be improving. But what's really holding China back is still that deflation and also a very prolonged property slump. Property prices, property investments have been falling by close to 10% a year for the last 3 years. This has been China has had a property-driven financial crisis longer than the last global financial crisis. I mean, that lasted about 2 years. In China's case, it's been more than 3 years already. So, but looking forward, I mean, I think this year China will still hit about close to 5% growth. They will make sure of that by legitimate or not so legitimate means. But I see a slow recovery, right? It will take them a few years to work out the overcapacity. The good news in the last month or so is finally they acknowledge that there is severe overcapacity. For all of last year, right up to first quarter of this year, they denied any suggestions of overcapacity. They said this is just Western countries having sour grapes. But this is now beginning to change, right? They have been saying that these price wars need to stop. We shouldn't have this sort of nature, right? This involution. We need to find ways to boost consumer demand, find new export markets. So it'll take them a while, maybe a couple more years to work out this overcapacity. It'll take them also a while for property prices to hit rock bottom. And then I think the Chinese economy will start, maybe not recovering at the rate we used to. We are used to expecting from China 7-8% growth. But even if they manage to maintain 5% growth for the next decade or so, it'll be, they'll certainly hit high-income country levels by the end of this decade.
Well, they just hit their targets or surpassed their market expectations of 5.2% for Q2, right?
That's right.
But more pertinently, let's bring the conversation about China's deflationary economic model closer to home. How do you see this impacting Southeast Asia or Singapore?
Yeah. So Suen would certainly speak to the overcapacity that's affecting the manufacturing industries in the rest of Southeast Asia. Thankfully for Singapore, we don't compete head-on with much of Chinese industry because we are higher tech. We are more about R&D. We are more about not technology intensive. Although China is becoming very competitive in those things. And above all, we are much more services oriented now, right? So we actually run a trade surplus with China, right? Because we export a lot of our high-end services to them, including mice, of course, right? Don't forget, you are also an export industry, right? You are not you don't rely on domestic consumption, right? Much of your revenues, your profits come from visitors, right? Visiting Singapore and spending money at mice. So we benefit from our comparative advantage and the fact that we are complementary in our economic structure to the Chinese one. The rest of Southeast Asia is much more trouble. I mean, you go to Malaysia, you go to Thailand, their manufacturers are complaining, bloody murder, right? And because of China is part of RCEP, we can't retaliate with tariffs. We can't do anything to kind of level the playing field. And why are Chinese goods so cheap in Southeast Asia? Because of such overcapacity, and that's partly due to weak consumption and weak consumption growth in the mainland.
Suen, if you could add to that, what are the implications of an underperforming Chinese or economic slowdown in China?
Well, I mean, just to add to what Donald has said, and as well as the tariffs, right? So, I think the tariffs, what it might do, and there's a lot of concern that if the demand for Chinese goods is somehow crimped in the US as well as in the EU, where will that demand go, right? And where will the goods go? Will it come to Southeast Asia and further flood the markets with cheap goods? So China has become so good in its manufacturing capabilities that it's cornered not just the EV high-end market, but really down the other sort of sectors, manufacturing sectors, textiles, footwear, toys, right? So, and this is a real problem for Southeast Asian local industries, and you will see rising protectionist pressures in Southeast Asia as well in response to these cheap Chinese goods. So that's one thing, and I think Southeast Asia desperately needs the Chinese consumer market to open up so that they can actually export also to China as a market, as a final destination market. And that is, I think, an ongoing conversation that Southeast Asia needs to have with China. And the good thing is, as Donald has pointed out, I think the Chinese have hoisted in this message. I think they are aware of it. And even in their investments overseas, they have started to be more sensitive to the fact that the local economies need to benefit. Don't just go and build infrastructure and bring your Chinese workers with you, but create employment. So I think the Chinese are slowly hoisting this in. And actually also just to highlight that it's not all doom and gloom, because there was a report recently that actually the Chinese exports of green tech has been a huge benefit for the region in terms of dealing with CO2 emissions and those sort of climate change targets as well.
China is a leader, somewhat surprisingly, in green technologies, and it's taking its climate responsibilities very seriously. So if Southeast Asia can kind of tap on that and extract as much, get as much technology transfers, then we can also have our own green, globally competitive green industry, right from manufacturing down to setting standards. Right, Singapore is also a global leader in setting ESG standards. The other thing to note is that before COVID, talking about Southeast Asia's relative advantages, before COVID, our main export industry the export industry that was growing the fastest vis-a-vis China was tourism, right? Chinese tourists coming to Thailand, to Indonesia, Bali in particular, was the fastest growing market segment. And post-COVID, that has stopped, right? China is no longer the fastest growing market for tourism in any of the regional economies. For a variety of reasons, partly because of the slowdown in China, there's much less outbound to other countries tourism. Second, there are also specific causes, right? The fear that they might be kidnapped in Thailand is hurting outbound Chinese tourism to Thailand. But hopefully in the next few years, that would turn around. Yeah.
Okay. While we speak a lot about China's economic might, Emin, if I can ask you also about China's soft power, its attempts to stand tall in the global world order. We've seen China in the last few years make very bold steps in terms of being a global power broker or a peace broker at the very least. Just to give an example, China's success in successfully negotiating a resumption of the diplomatic ties between Saudi and Iran back in 2023. But there's potentially a trust deficit or a trust question about China's role as a global power broker. How do you see China's increasing role as an international mediator, destined to succeed or doomed to fail?
It's a good question. I guess for me, if you look at the newspaper, conflict is multiplying right now. And we need more conflict transformation or mediation. So if China wants to invest in peacemaking, frankly, that's a good thing. The question, I think, is not so much whether they will succeed or fail outright, but whether they'll be trusted, as you say, by the conflict actors. Because the success of a mediation or a negotiation depends on that trust, their credibility, the skill, and their impartiality. And those traits, if I might say, it's not just held by certain parties, but by Singaporeans too. And that's where we go back to Singapore. Size might be small, but we are trusted, we are agile, and we also have the infrastructure, such like these, to host such negotiations and mediation breakthroughs. So maybe a thought for the MICE industry is that the next mediation or negotiation success, it doesn't have to take place in the halls of New York or Geneva. It could take place here, where we curate the space, not just for the event, but also for the trust building between the parties.
Well, we have the UN Convention on Mediation named after Singapore, so that's a first nod in the direction of Singapore's role in global power plays, right? Donald, is the rules-based international order that we speak about, we've spoken a lot about China's role, US role, China's attempted rise, US wanting to pull out of many bodies. Is the rules-based international order that we're so used to in the last 80 years broken today?
Oh, it's not broken. It's certainly changing, it's evolving. And actually that process started not with Trump, not even with Trump 1.0. It started pretty much right after the global financial crisis. And there was a sense then, as Suen was explaining, that globalization hadn't served the interests of many segments of the populations of developed countries. Not just the US, but also in Europe. I mean, what do you think Brexit was about? It was about rejection of this, ever more integration with the rest of Europe. So the rules are evolving, they're changing. I don't think whether it's the US or Britain, they want to withdraw from this system, but they want to renegotiate the terms of their engagement with global trade and with the multilateral rules-based system. What does that mean for the rest of us? The rest of us, should, we have to obviously adjust to this. So one kind of adjustment, right? During COVID, what was the big adjustment that many of us said we had to do? We had to make our supply chains more resilient, right? We cannot be so dependent on just one source country, in this case China, because China manufactured, as Suen was saying, pretty much everything. So post-COVID, you could see many corporations, many industries were undergoing what was widely and still widely referred to as the China plus one strategy. Multinationals, including Chinese firms, right, looking for alternative locations. We'll still produce in China because China is still is a very large market, but we need a backup, right? The backup might be in Vietnam, might be in India. Right? So Apple announced that it will move a lot of its smartphone manufacturing facilities to India. Samsung no longer produces any smartphones in China. It produces it all in Vietnam.
Economic contingencies.
Yeah, in this case, in the case of Samsung, it's not even economic contingency. We were just substituted Vietnam for China, right? So what you saw post-2018, when the first Trump administration slapped tariffs on China, since 2018, China's trade surplus with the US has actually shrank by about 40%. Meanwhile, Vietnam, Mexico's trade surplus with the US has increased, shot up, right? So you can see that global supply chains have already been adjusting, right, to this new world order, that it is now much more, not just about US and China, it's much more multipolar. And Singapore has, to some extent, also benefited, right? For rightly or wrongly. I mean, have you heard of this phrase called Singapore washing? Right? No. This is about Chinese firms that want to gain more respectability in the US, in Western markets. So they set up a company, that doesn't do much in Singapore, but just so that they can say we are a Singapore-based.
Certainly not a firm you'll hear much about, not a phrase you'll hear much about in the mainstream media.
Yes, yeah. But you hear it very much in financial circles. I think it was Financial Times that popularized the term Singapore washing. It used to be that Hong Kong would be the place that Chinese firms would go to gain access to the rest of the world, to gain access to global capital markets. But because Hong Kong is increasingly mainlandized, right? It's really increasingly perceived, rightly or wrongly, as just another Chinese city. Singapore has now taken on the mantle as the best place to go to as a stepping stone to accessing other markets, right? Particularly Western markets.
Sue-Ann, if I can just ask you for your thoughts very quickly on the rules-based international order. Broken, needs change, fine as it is.
Definitely under strain because of all of these disruptions, and the chief reason, as Donna and I have pointed out, is really the disenchantment with globalization, right? And you've asked, can it be fixed? And I just wanted to echo what Donald said earlier. Actually, one of the things that must be done, a key domestic priority for every government, is to address the inequalities that have arisen from free trade and globalization, because there will always be dislocations and disruptions, but there needs to be that adaptation. But if you're unable to, you are going to continue to feed this politics of anger and you can't move forward, and then you will always have the rise of populist leaders who will then try and break everything down. And so I think, you had asked us before, do you think it can be fixed and what can be done? And actually, I think we are at a stage now where the system needs to actually take a few steps backwards in order to move forward again, meaning that things have changed and the domestic constraints, the fiscal constraints, have meant that we have to price in the fact that countries are just going to be more protectionistic. Countries are going to be more constrained and are not going to be able to offer the free trade deals or the terms that you are used to at the height of WTO globalization. And so how do you take a few steps backwards, find that common ground again, and move forward? Because I think that's what's going to be necessary, and it's going to actually take a lot of political leadership to be able to carry their constituencies in order to then negotiate something that is acceptable at the international level.
Thank you. Emin, if I could ask you, as we talk about, the politics of anger, the rejection of globalization, does this render international organizations useless, or maybe that's too strong a word, less efficient? And what becomes of dialogue? What becomes of doing the right thing? Yeah.
Sure. I think sometimes when we're talking about the systems and the rules, we forget that behind all of it is people, right? And so often at the UN, we used to say that the problems with the UN were not because the failure of the building. It was that the UN is the sum of the actions of the people that come from the various UN member states. So the question is, how do we bring about good outcomes among such people? So in the negotiations that we teach in periods of uncertainty, there are three things that we highlight. One is that you need to first map your players, your personalities, right? You need to know who are the key stakeholders, but you also need to know who are the spoilers in the game. The second thing that we need to know is the timeline for the negotiations. Why do we say that? It's because by the time the dish is put on a dining table, it's often too late to make those changes to the outcome. What you want to do is to go with the chef when he's going to the market and he's deciding what ingredients to put in and to buy. You want to make sure your interest is there. You also want to be with the chef in the kitchen when he's cutting up, and so you ensure that your items are not tossed into the bin. And lastly, you want to be there when the dish is plated to ensure all your interests are served. But the third thing that we highlight is about the system, right? You need to learn the system and adapt to it. Because no negotiation at the end of the day is 100% new. The interesting thing is that history leaves both landmines, but also pathways, right? And so the question is, how do you figure out the pathways so that you avoid the landmines in those negotiations? And in the work that we do, facilitating such difficult and sensitive negotiations, we're finding that the soft infrastructure is just as important. And I think that's where the MICE industry can come into play, creating that space, that human connection. You know, we do this on a very small scale as a nonprofit, but the MICE industry could actually take this much forward and create huge impact and build trust between the people that's much needed today.
Just what you were saying about going with the chef to the market, being at the table with him to plate the dish, reminds me of Prof. Jayakumar's book, Be at the table or be on the table, right? Participate or be eaten. Moving on, with the global state of play as it is, and Eamon has spoken a little bit about opportunities for Singapore and MICE. If I could ask more broadly, what are some of the opportunities for Singapore in this global landscape? And taking a question from Pigeonhole, maybe I'll reframe the question to the question from Pigeonhole, which is, what unique advantages does Singapore offer in terms of navigating this uncertainty? Sue-Ann?
Trusted node. So I think, you know, just building on what Eamon says, I think in this age where there's so much uncertainty, people value stability, predictability, and actually a certain sense of integrity. And I think that is going to be a key commodity that if Singapore can steward and have, it could really be that place where you are a trusted broker, a trusted node in a complex supply chain, you know, too small to have any great, you know, ambitions to rule the world. And so I think in a sense, the key word is trust, and to the extent that Singapore can manifest that and steward that could be a key thing for us.
I'm going to build on this trust and ask a question of Eamon, right? And adding another layer on it is another question from Pigeonhole that's relevant here. Eamon, you spoke earlier about, it's interesting how you say that we can talk about hosting these high-profile conflict mediations in Singapore. What are some of the ways how, and how can we position ourselves to do so? And it builds on what Sue-Ann was talking about in terms of the trusted node, but adding your lens of conflict mediation, high-level hosting events in Singapore.
Sure. I'll give you an example. So recently, I was asked to chair a negotiation between two countries on a thorny issue. And what I decided to do was to fly the parties in to Singapore one day early, not for policy prep, but actually to tour Singapore together, right? And so we went to see different districts, and it was a very much curated, thought-out program, because I wanted to ensure that there were spaces for shared meals, and I had a tour guide, and I briefed him ahead so that he could share about social cohesion and harmony through his own life stories. And then over dinner, I created space so that the two leaders of each side could speak privately and share freely, but at the same time have his delegations on the side so that there was a certain amount of comfort level. And so when we actually went into the negotiations on the second day, the thorny issue was still on the table, but we managed to get a breakthrough in the negotiations. And when I was talking to the parties, they actually said themselves that the dynamic in the room had changed because they now understood the other party. You know, they saw themselves not as you are the other side, but a brother, a friend, right? And I think going back to Sven's point, that we are a trust node, and as Singapore, you really have that credibility. So now the question is about making use of it. As Dylan, you talked about, you know, you have the convention on mediation. So why not talk more about it and highlight how Singapore is willing to host such discussions, and we can be discreet. We're not there for the limelight of it. We're happy to provide the infrastructure, but also the design thinking that comes behind it, combining design thinking and diplomacy. Again, I think the mass industry has thought a lot about it, and so if we can combine that kind of force, you really could be that place for such breakthroughs.
If we're running short of time, but I want to ask a question about digitalization. And as we spoke about China, we spoke about the US, let me pose a contrarian thought. And that is, what about non-state actors? Do we see a future where for example, a multinational tech company, Google, Apple, or any future AI mega corporation rise to be a superpower? They have all the information, they have all the data. Is this a plausible situation 10, 20, 30 years from now? Suen?
It already is. When I had some interactions with Google talking about, you know, their trust and safety, content moderation issues, I asked them, does Google have a foreign policy? Because a lot of these tech companies already wield the powers of governments. They are as influential as and can actually influence the politics and decision-making of government. So actually the short answer is that they already are. And I mean, actually just look at Elon Musk, you know, and this whole blowout with the, you know, between Trump and Elon Musk. But the fact that now Trump was sort of saying, you know, can we re-look at Starlink and see, you know, what we can do? And they realized that actually the DoD, the US has become really dependent on Starlink. They, so the critical dependencies are already there. And the fact that these tech companies are the providers of critical infrastructure, critical services, but are also, the governments are sometimes finding it very difficult to regulate them, already shows that they are, in a sense, what you have said, and this is going to be actually a key issue that needs to be worked out, especially in the age of AI.
Well, at the same time, governments can still do still have a lot of authority. I mean, look at Alibaba and Tencent, right? I mean, at the start of COVID, or 6 months into COVID, they developed this health code. I mean, we had the Trace Together, which was developed by government, GovTech. But in China's case, the health code was developed by these tech giants. And they were riding high. I mean, the share prices of Tencent and Alibaba were at record levels. And then suddenly the Chinese government decided, the regulators decided that they're getting a bit too powerful. They're, you know, intervening in matters of governance. They are constraining the autonomy of the state. And the Chinese state just decided to go after Chinese consumer tech companies, including the very two that had helped them deal with COVID. And today they are you know, much smaller than they were before in terms of market capitalization. So I don't think tech companies will replace sovereigns, will replace governments, but certainly they are going to wield a lot more power and influence than they've ever had.
If I can maybe move a little bit now into, you spoke earlier, Donald, about AI, DeepSeek playing a key role, reimagining what we thought of American power in AI. What about the flip side of censorship? We're seeing DeepSeek and other Chinese AI have elements of censorship. Try asking DeepSeek a lot of information about Tiananmen Square. I don't think you're going to get the full story. How do you then deal with AI and censorship or regulatory frameworks for contrarian or conflicting views? Yeah.
The interesting thing about, and I encourage all of you to do this, at least for yourself. So, because I'm based in Hong Kong and I work on China, so it really helps if I can go to China. Right? So I don't know if I'll be stopped from entering mainland China. So who better than to ask than DeepSeek, right? So I asked DeepSeek, is Donald Lo banned from entering China? And amazingly, it was not a yes/no answer. They gave like a 3-page answer on why it might there might be some controversy. And it was extremely extensive. And the answer was there for about 10 seconds, 15 seconds. And then suddenly it disappeared. Sorry, I'm not. So it's not that DeepSeek is censored, or at least not in the ways that we think about censorship. It certainly has the means and the capabilities to provide, what generative AI programs do, right? Very comprehensive, helpful answers. It's just that on top of that, there's a filter, right? The filter, they're trying to anticipate what might be problematic in the eyes of the censors. And then it's kind of self-censorship, right? So I don't think it will hold back the power of generative AI and the development of generative AI, even in countries like China. Certainly before DeepSeek, we thought that was what was going to prevent Chinese generative AI companies from being as competitive as their American competitors. But since DeepSeek came along, I'm a lot more optimistic, if you will, about the competitiveness of generative AI of Chinese companies.
Sue-Ann?
Just a quick adding to what Donald says, though. I mean, it's not just DeepSeek, though, right? So actually, this goes to the point that, we actually need to make sure that there is a plurality of systems out there, LLMs or not, right? Because, ChatGPT will have a certain version of truth based on the data that it's been trained on. Some of you would know that in Singapore, we're trying to do this sea lion thing where we're trying to train an LLM based on Southeast Asian languages just to make sure that that body of data knowledge is not excluded from what will eventually become, an AI-mediated, understanding of truth, And so it really just depends on what kind of data you train your LLMs on, right? And it's so important that there is a plurality of sources and voices so that they're not excluded.
Okay, just in the interest of time, 1 minute, quick answers from all the panelists. In this current geopolitical climate that we are in, what is the one skill set that you think individuals or businesses in Singapore need to navigate a multipolar world? We'll start from Donald and make our way down the panel before we wrap.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was going to run out of things to say already. Adaptability. I don't know, most of the people in the room don't recall a time when we didn't have this. We didn't have the kind of very competitive mice industry. I was in government between 1998 to 2003, and those were pretty, somewhat depressing times. Our economy didn't grow in that 5-year period, and then post 2003, 2004, things just took off, right? Not least this gleaming skyline. And I think the reason we were able to do that was really take advantage of the opportunities that build the Singapore brand and adapt to the changing environment around us.
Sue-Ann?
Discernment and critical thinking, because no one knows what truth is anymore.
Emin?
I think until AI takes over, which someday probably will, we're still dealing with human beings, so I would say trust building. Because just now, I think Sue-Ann and I were talking, you can talk about the next 50 years, but if the world blows up because of conflict, what are we talking about, right? And so at the end of the day, we need to find ways to de-escalate and prevent the tensions and bring peace.
Just to wrap up, I think it's my personal opinion that conflict management, negotiation should be essential business learning for all business leaders, right? And if you want to find out more about the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, talk to Emin about how businesses can invest in, or at the very least, co-create peace. With that, I would like to say thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for unpacking what's happening in the world today and sharing a glimpse of what's next. Please join me in a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dylan. And to our panelists, I'd like to invite all of you to perhaps take a couple of steps forward for a photo, please. How to navigate a multipolar world. Lots of insights. Also talking about the might of China in our global world order here. Particularly loved how we had a couple of comments about taking a few steps backwards for us to truly take that big leap forward, right? And wrapping things up with the skills we need to navigate the future. Indeed, very, very important. One more time, please, ladies and gentlemen, for Dylan and our panelists. Thank you so much for your time, for joining us today as well. A lot to chat about going beyond borders in the multipolar world. Thank you.